Hey everybody, this is Carson Grubaugh.
Hi, I'm Sean Robinson.
This is Living the Line, and today we're going to be following up on Berserk. We looked at Volume One with the Uncanny Omar from Near Mint Condition, who turned me on to it. I was a little skeptical still by the end of Volume One, but at Omar's recommendation and many of my students, and just it seems like the community online is really behind Berserk. So we decided we're going to keep going with it, and we've now read Deluxe Volume 2.
And if
So
you need any proof that we are pandering people who will look for your approval, we have heard your words. We no. I thought it was a really interesting read, the first one, and yeah, Omar's perspective was very interesting as a person who's read and been enthusiastic about it for a really long period of time. So I took his recommendation pretty strongly, and so here it is.
yeah, and I will say by the end of the second volume, I'm more like I've got all of them because I kind of figured, well, we're gonna keep doing these now. Um, but by the end of the second volume, I was more wanting to keep reading now. I'm more hooked, but I'm like holding myself back from reading Volume 3 actually now. So I'm more hooked and like, I want to see what happens next. Um, and
Yeah,
I'm
well,
now that we are doing this video, now I can go read Volume 3, but I'm trying to like make sure I don't skip ahead. So
it,
I think first let's just flip through. We have a ton of things throughout story wise and art wise that to talk about in this book. So
Yeah, and one of the things right off the top that was interesting to me because the book, as we talked about in Volume One, 600 pages of Volume One, uh, it starts off with a sort of episodic format and then transforms part of the way through into going back in time and starting with Guts, the main character, as a young kid. And very interesting that right as he makes this transition to Guts being very young, he tries out a whole host of different art styles. And you really have, somebody who was making, you know, already professional art in the first segment, all of a sudden tries out so many different things. And you really have, from my perspective anyway, the art in the beginning of this volume is not as accomplished in some ways that's the stuff that happened um, at the beginning. And you get the I got the feeling anyway that he's really trying out so many things. It's almost like he's like willing to be a kid again, or willing to be sort of like a journeyman, and see if he can put a few more quivers in his arrows in his quiver.
yeah, I agree that I was really kind of this story arc, the Golden Age, and I know that that's the one that most of the fans like really feel like is where the book takes off, which is true in terms of story, but I really do feel like his like some of these drawings, the anatomy just seems
Yeah.
really funky. He's getting rid of all the tones and all of the black, like spotting of blacks. Um, I think some of it has to do with the poor reproduction. That's like the whole first, because this is 3 volumes collected into one,
Right.
and that whole first volume reproduces, and we'll take a look at that really poorly. So I think some of that's that. I also think he's just not as good at drawing the thinner, like child figures. They're
Yeah.
really funky and rubbery. But yeah, there's a lot of really like ugly faces. And I had that same impression. Like, man, the art really took a step backwards. And he's trying to figure out too how to deal with his cross hatching that he does in a more minimal style. And again, some of like this panel reproduces really nicely, actually.
There's a
And it looks
few
all right here.
there's a few
Um,
pages at the beginning that seem to be from the original negative, and then the rest seems to be like it's from a printed edition.
And
Uh,
Omar said that that's the case in the original volume printing too. So that's obviously just what Dark Horse has been supplied with, which is too bad. But yeah, I totally agree that, and the reproduction doesn't help. So a lot of his cross hatching minimizes down to, and we'll look at it more closely, but minimizes down to this ugly like hashtag pattern that
right.
just looks like dirt. Sometimes he is using it for dirt, but sometimes it's meant to be shading and it still just looks like dirt to me.
Yeah, it's broken up, the multiple generations and everything like that. But yeah, I think that the sort of some of the drawing weakness that's at the beginning here is because he's trying out so many different things simultaneously. You've taken this character that he's already gotten accustomed to drawing over 500 pages and aged him down to, it's a little ambiguous what age he's supposed to be here, maybe 10 years old. But that in itself is a very, very difficult technical challenge. Um, and
Yeah, and it seems intentional to me too, because the story, what is interesting to me now about this story is the first volume kind of ends with this big like master battle fight that goes wrong, and you understand that Guts and Griffith have a history. And then my guess is that the rest of the series, and now that it's not going to be complete, I don't know, but it like goes back to his youth, and then it's like, okay, how did those two characters get to that point?
right,
And I think he purposely also, it's called the Golden Age, and even though there's an atrocious like sexual abuse that ended the last volume and starts off this one, I think there is supposed to be like a lighter tone in general to the art, like the good old days back when the band was forming.
right,
And I wonder if that like lighter touch on the art, because the pages just feel light and airy compared to
right.
the beginning of the volume one and some of the later stuff here.
Yeah, we
So
were.
I think that might be intentional as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I was noting is that the influence of the art at the very beginning is very different from a lot of, what you might consider a more typical, Japanese cartooning influence, with the sort of exploratory use of hatching as rendering on the form, to create form, and things you might associate more with European comics or a sort of European context than a Japanese context. Which is not to say that there aren't those things in Japanese comics, especially like Japanese men's comics. Um, you have a lot of that type of thing, but this specific type of rendering and the specific type of hatching, he's drawing from a lot of sources. And I just wanted to say it's like a really adventurous. It seems like, over the course of a couple hundred pages, he really rises to the challenge. Not to spoil it, by the time we get to the end here, I mean, I was just like blown away by the artwork.
Yeah,
By the time
yeah.
we've gotten 400 pages through here, he's synthesized all of these things that he's like learned as he's gone. And just to talk about the story for a little bit, his surrogate father here, I mean, he learns is a total bastard.
Yeah,
Um,
has basically sold him out to this character who rapes him.
right,
And I think that's important too, because in the first volume, I was joking about like there seems to be all this homoerotic or homophobic undercurrents that I found to be like kind of accidental and humorous. And by the end, I started to realize no, this character does have a past of abuse. And I was also speculating that Griffith and Guts maybe had some kind of unresolved homoerotic tension between them, and then that plays out. But it seems tied to this early trauma.
right,
This
and
is the character you're talking about here, right?
yeah, and his essentially surrogate father who has sold him out. And a lot of the struggle in the book, the emotional struggle in the book, is basically like, how do you hate somebody? Basically, this is a character that deserves to be hated. Um,
Yeah.
but how do you hate somebody who is the person who like showed you any kind of affection? Guts is like stripped from the body of a hanged woman as an infant and grown by this guy, or no, raised by this guy. How do you hate the person who is like taking care of you in a certain kind of way, even if they're total bastard? And it's
Yeah,
interesting to
this
have that.
Gambino, that's his name.
Gambino.
Yeah.
It's interesting to have that, you know, fairly realistic emotional dynamic inside of a sort of swords and sorcery world. Although the sorcery part is subdued for the first couple hundred pages here. I was actually kind of shocked when it came back in and the characters were like, there are demons, there are gods, and it's like, oh, you guys don't remember that? And it's like, oh, right, we've reset everything.
Yeah, like that stuff's like almost being introduced into a world that doesn't have it. So I like that it's building back up to that stuff.
Right.
And that like that cycle of someone paying you attention and affection, but also being abusive, then plays out throughout the book. And that's what's most interesting to me, is tracking from what I thought was kind of just like silly, kind of homoerotic,
Yeah.
maybe accidental. In this book, it becomes more clear, to actually like there being a really deep emotional point behind it. And so a lot of reading this volume and making notes for it, I tried to recreate like how my understanding of what the author was up to developed. So that's a lot of the things I had to say. But also, Sean, you've pointed out like how amazing these battle scenes
Yeah.
are. Like, holy crap. So even this, where I feel like he is coming to terms with that art style. And I don't know, I do think it's the reproduction, because on pages like this that reproduce well, I'm not as turned off by it.
Yeah.
A lot of it's in the bad reproduction.
Well,
But
I've
there's a
talked
number of these battle spreads that are just, yeah, phenomenal.
I've talked
And
about that a little bit in the course of the Cerebus reproduction. That one of the consequences of bad reproduction is that you focus on the drawing flaws that are always present in any cartooning endeavor, because Jesus Christ, it's hard to draw a comic. I mean, it just takes so much time, every single figure. Uh, but when you have the fine detail blown out and the shadow details filled in, you're kind of left with a different kind of regard for the underlying figures, because all of that surface decoration isn't there to sort of, you know, it changes your perception of the drawing, is what I'm saying.
yeah, and his use of cross hatching. So this is a page that I scanned, and this one's also bad. His use of the cross hatching does start to look patchy,
Right.
where it's always like a hashtag pattern that lines like perfectly up to itself, and it isolates itself from the rest of the character. It's just like these little globs of value on there. And when the reproduction is better, there's actually a little bit more integration of the value into the rest of the image. Like
Right.
this up here, the cross hatching works better, it's reproduced better. But here and here, it takes that clumpy, chunky look, and so that was really irritating me. But when we had talked to Omar, he had kind of pre-warned us that historically this, I guess it would be volume 4,
Right.
in the original printings, like people are aware that it has bad printing. I would be interested if anyone that watches this could tell us what happened there. Like, were the negatives destroyed?
Yeah.
You know, are the fans aware of why that reproduction is bad? Because obviously it's not something Dark Horse is doing wrong. They've just been provided with poor materials. I'm also curious, because we're pretty well aware that the manga artists don't sell stuff, like why there aren't. I'm assuming it's just, well, I can cash in on an English translation, but why am I going to pay my assistants to go scan the original art?
Well,
You know, why isn't there a project to scan the originals?
if you're talking about artwork from 1990 or 1991, every single page would have to have the tone adjusted because it's shrunk over time. None of these
Mm.
tones are archival. In the, before the 70s, tones weren't directly put on the original artwork. They would be marked instead with wax pencil as a guide. So for a project that was prior to that, if you had the original artwork, you could just retone. But on something like this, where the tones are so complex, I mean, they're put directly on the original artboard, it would just be a tremendous undertaking.
It would take a psychopath like Sean Robinson of Living the Line to go back and digitally fix all that. Speaking of tone, I landed on the page. I scanned this one. This was another good example of why we're not just being nitpicky guys in my mind. But this character, Casca, when he meets what are they called? The Band of Eagles.
Yeah.
It's a group of like mercenaries led by Griffith. And this female warrior is part of it. And throughout the whole, I don't know, however many first couple hundred pages of her being there, this is what she looks like. And then later on, when the reproduction gets better, I have scans of that, she's constantly got tone over her. So she's supposed to have very dark skin. But I am introduced in the story to a character with no tone because it's blown out of the reproduction. And so that when I finally saw her, like here, she has the tone, but it also looks like she's shaded or something.
Yeah, I actually,
Um,
I wondered if maybe the reason she has kind of olive skin or has this sort of, she's got like a 20% tone on her in the later sections is because she's got those points on her hair like guts. She could almost be like a female guts, and that was sort of one of the things that I was like misled to believe in her introduction is maybe she's like a half sister or something like that.
oh,
Um,
okay.
but um,
Yeah,
but
because they obviously share some kind of like antagonistic relationship right out the gate.
Right, and as we move through the uh, different volumes represented in this book, you see that relationship change in a very satisfying way. And man, do you see the drawing change in a really satisfying way? It's interesting to see these earlier ones. She still looks like herself, but the later ones, my goodness, it really gives him the opportunity to show off what he knows about anatomy and rendering. And we'll hit a few of those pages in the later books, but later in the book. But
Yeah. And
so
here they're fighting kind of the brother sister thing, maybe. And then Griffith comes in as the leader of this. I think it's the Band of Eagles, Band of Hawks,
Hawks,
Band of Hawks. And the design, I like that the character design matches that weird, like I called it gay Batman thing
right?
that he is by the time he's like obviously risen to become some kind of metaphysical uber bad guy. But here it's like the light white knight version of him
Hmm.
and very regal and pretty, but the hawk mask thing is still there. So I really like that piece of design. um and just his character becomes fascinating to me throughout. Here was another scene with the developing relationship between Casca and Guts where she's basically just has to be keeping him warm, I think.
Yeah, because
And
he's
he
been.
wakes up and he's like, don't touch me, which is something that goes back all the way to volume one and makes more sense after you see that he was raped. um, and then he wakes up and he's like, oh, it's a woman. And he seems even more distressed by the fact that it's a woman, that there's someone touching him.
Right.
And then immediately kind of thinks back to Griffith, who's like this beautiful androgynous character. So I'm still thinking like there's sexual tension more between him and Griffith. And then that really comes to a head, pun intended, when they kind of have it out in the field. And there's just all this conversation that I'm going, oh yeah, that like these guys are into each other. It's like he's saying, because I realized I wanted you.
Mhm.
And they just have these undertones.
Very
Um,
loaded.
yeah, and then it gets explicit. And then there's this like Casca's always kind of watching, like being jealous of their relationship.
Mhm.
And at first it seems like she is also sexually drawn to Griffith. And Gut straight up says, like, are you a homo?
Right.
Uh, and and he just kind of avoids it at that point. Griffith avoids that.
Yeah,
But
Griffith is
there's,
a smart manipulator who knows when to push it and when to drop it.
yeah, and then he keeps saying, I want you, and giving him these coy little smiles. You're interesting. I want you. So it's almost like a flirtation. And Casca's back here behind the tree, like watching this whole thing. And you can see that she's angry about this. Like they both probably have feelings for Griffith at this point. She's, I don't know, she's distressed by that. And Guts is like, oh, that makes me like, how can you know that you want me? Like we've never even met before. This makes me sick. So he's obviously distressed by what he thinks is the gay undertones. But then it's like, okay, me and you, we're gonna fight. And then it's going back to the sword as the gigantic, like erect phallus,
Right.
like he's trying to reject this feelings. Um, but is obviously kind of like, I don't know, turned on or drawn into this character. And he keeps saying, this makes me sick. And he's saying that's that superior attitude, but like he's obviously struggling. I think he's obviously struggling with his attraction to this man, but given his past abuse, has kind of and they keep going to these images. Like I know if you hold a sword, that's where it's at, but it seems so explicit to me. Like,
Well,
um,
yeah, and we talked about this in the context of Fist of the North Star, but it's interesting that this takes the subtext of you know ever all conflict being about violence and sex just being a shade of that violence. That takes that subtext and makes it more text when these characters have a fairly realistic emotional inner life due to trauma and things like that. It's a very interesting and bold. I mean, I thought it was fairly shocking. I mean, I can't imagine like you know, you take like a pro wrestling context or something and you have a pro wrestler discuss like, you know, sexual trauma or something, and that's why he's in the ring. I mean, that would be the
yeah,
equivalent. Um,
and having a complex emotional relationship with one of the other wrestlers, and the symbolism's all over. Like, I mean, come on, this sword's like two balls in the dick, and he's
right,
walking around. I mean, at it just, but it starts to become more worth it. And here, this is another, like, I didn't fully understand what was happening yet at this point in the reading, but like he sticks his sword in the mouth, and then Guts is like, I'll show you how mouth should be used in a fight. And then he bites the sword and starts bleeding. And at this point, it was still a little bit funny to me, but I was starting to understand the complexity of it, and the story was more interesting. And I was happy that my suspicion about what maybe was going on in volume 1 was starting to pay off. And during this fight scene, there's some scans I took too, where like you can't even see Griffith because the lines that they use to render him are so delicate that they're all just blown out.
yeah,
So that's unfortunate. Oh yeah, Band of Hawks, and now you belong to me. So there's this sadistic kind of ownership thing happening, which continues to play out.
right.
Here's a war scene, Sean, one
Yeah,
of the ones you were
yeah.
wanted to talk about.
There's a ton of these double page spreads where you have people amassed, moving against each other in a very interesting kind of way. And I was interested in these for a couple different reasons. One is you get so many repetitions of it in different contexts. So we tagged one of the earlier ones too, where these people are storming a castle. And here we've got the cavalry on horseback mowing over, some soldiers on foot, and several other clashes along these lines. And it's a really interesting, if you have a story that's just about conflict in a world where things are just totally horrendous for the people who are, you know, caught up in these battles. This is 100-year war that's been waged between these two kingdoms, and their mercenary group is essentially helping one of the sides, uh, finally make some purchase in the war. You get this horrible, horrible place, and since the whole story is based on conflict like that, you have these opportunities to have these people as masses. It's almost like in the tight ones like this, you actually see the individuals, even though they're not always necessarily rendered as individuals. But then in some of the faraway shots, it's almost like fluid mechanics or something. Like you're watching like you know
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of acorns roll down a hill or something, which is a really that's the way that generals see fighting. You don't see these individual troops. You see like a wave crashing against a rock.
Going back to, I don't know if I took the tag off, but that one where they're all crashing against the
Right.
castle, which was the first one that really like, wow, yeah, I'm not gonna be able to find it.
And you
But
think
yeah,
about
there's a number of them, and they're always beautiful. I mean, these are the ones where you go like, yeah, I don't like this art. Even those, by this point, his hatching style and stuff's getting more developed. But
well, he's
even
taking
on
the
some of the early ones, it's like,
yeah,
holy cow, this is just, it's so like cool. It's just cool.
yeah. And it's funny like in a medium like comics where the words and the pictures, um, you know, I wouldn't even say they have equal weight. I mean, an image like this resonates with you throughout everything else that you read. We've given the most space to this, so this is important. It's not just like, oh, hey, here's a picture that I drew. Maybe it is just, hey, here's a thing that I want to draw. But the more space you give to the thing, the more impact it has, and the more it carries through the other segments of it. So I think the everything leading up to these battles, you just see the panels getting larger and larger, and all of a sudden, bam! Here's, you know, there it is.
Yeah.
Here's the
Yeah.
money shot.
And it's good because really, unlike my assumptions about this book, especially, it's not fight porn.
No,
It's not just leading up to these. Those things almost seem less important to me. They're like, okay, I'm trying to tell this more complex emotional story, and I've just got to throw some of this stuff in there to keep people going, wow, this shit's cool. Like the big fight scenes to me, actually, almost to me, seems like throwaway. Like, I know it's important, but it's not as important as the like 3 chapters of them fighting in the field and kind of having this conversation, or it's not as important as some of the political manipulations and stuff.
right, but they suggest something about those other scenes, that those scenes take
Yeah.
place in between those other things. You know, tells you that their lives are like roiled in conflict. And you know, what does it say, that like the home that he finds is with a bunch of guys who, like, you know, are essentially murderers for hire.
Yeah.
There's a scene later where they talk about, like, you know, do you murder people inside or do you murder people outside?
Oh, I don't remember that. Here's another battle scene. So talking about the stylistic experimentation, this looks like EC War Comics type of stuff to me. I love when he flips to the brush.
Yeah.
Like pages like this, especially in the middle of all of this fine cross hatching and little delicate lines and stuff. Pages like this, you're talking about those shocking, making a scene count, being willing to totally change what you're doing for the impact of it. That is impressive to me. And then to pull it off as well. Just like you've been doing this for 2 years, and then one day you just whip out the brush and you're like, turn in a badass piece like this, and then you go back to the thing you've been doing. It's pretty great. But yeah, this feels like I don't know, it doesn't look like manga to me.
Yeah.
It looks like he's been looking at Western EC War Comics and stuff.
Yeah, EC War Comics, or you know, the Milton Caniff.
Yeah. For some reason, I know you wouldn't think Kurtzman, but kind of the Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah, maybe. I'm imagining that as like a blow up of you know, Terry and the Pirates background.
Yeah, Kenneth for sure. And then here we just get more of this like interaction between them, where Guts is struggling with like what still seems to be an obvious attraction to the beautiful androgynous character, and they kind of get in this play water fight, and he's looking like shocked and embarrassed, and they're kind of playing it off as just like boys being boys and goofy, but there's an undertone underneath it.
And that's where we get the return of the Baylet.
Yeah.
This terrifyingly designed thing that pops up in the previous mega volume. And
yeah, and I scanned that because it looks better here. He figured out how to do the tone here better than in the previous volume.
Yeah.
But I found really interesting Griffith, as he knows he's a manipulator. He's obviously, at this point, I'm understanding it's not just a love relationship between them. Griffith is a narcissistic, like, egomaniac out to become a god, and he's manipulating everybody, and he's using his sexuality to do that. And you can see these moments where he makes himself like this very vulnerable, cute, childish type of character. So he'll put his own guard down to get, yeah, here it is, like that big childish quality in his face. Neat, huh? And it's like he's all of a sudden calling back to that 10-year-old that got abused, and making a connection with the Guts, who never got a chance to be a kid, and was like kind of activating that.
Yeah.
To put Guts' guard down and worm his way in.
Right.
And that to me is where the book starts to get fascinating. Like, it's all been cool up till now, but this is where I'm like, okay, I'm in. I want to go and read all. I just got number 8
Yeah.
yesterday in the mail. I want to go read them all, but I got to hold back.
Well, yeah, all
Do one at a time.
I didn't even make this connection until you just said that about the Griffin is a narcissistic manipulator. But I never fought in a mercenary band, but I was on my high school water polo team, and I recognize this dynamic from the sports context. When you have worked closely with someone and a wide range of people who are only brought together by the conflict that you share, you sometimes meet people that you wouldn't meet in another way. As an adult, you tend to meet people that have, similar like attitudes towards you, or maybe like similar things, and you can kind of gravitate towards people you want. But when you're younger and you're sort of thrown in with an almost random assortment of people, you meet somebody sometimes who you're both drawn to and repelled by, and especially if you haven't really figured out, what it is that is meaningful in life. Those figures can be these very strange, almost like mystical figures. And
Hmm.
yeah, I,
Yeah, that
I
makes
want I want to see
sense.
where it goes, but I have some I
And then
have some thoughts
if
with
he's
this.
like the captain of the team, he has to have that charisma.
That's right.
And Griffith obviously has charisma. He has pulled this band of mercenaries around him, and he uses this idea of like you're kind of free to do whatever you want.
Right.
Like he sells that to them. Um, and also like he makes each one of them. So here you see, okay, he's actually has these total egomaniacal, I will get my own kingdom. And then he like after immediately after being vulnerable and like winning Guts' heart, I will get my own kingdom. You will fight for my cause because you belong to me.
Yeah.
And it's like this master manipulator shit. Um, he's using his instinct for, I think, Guts' damaged sexuality and maybe conflict over his own attraction to men because of the abuse. And also probably just because he hasn't been around women. He was raised in a mercenary band. So
Right.
any sexuality was introduced by men, and he's only been around men. And then you have Casca too, which is like really the first time he's interacted
Yeah.
with a woman, I think. So
No,
it
you're absolutely right.
and he's like, oh shit, a woman, like why, and he doesn't like being touched for very good reason. So very confused character, and Griffith's playing on it. Here's another one here. This is the wave
Yeah,
that you're talking
that's
about, the
got
wave.
both of them at the same time. This is you get the some mild bit of individualization just because you're seeing them up close, but really, if you look at them, you're essentially just seeing like fluid dynamics. You see the
Yeah.
point of the attack on the left hand side. It's almost like a arrow, and then the other side is pushing in on the outer point of the arrow. This is a really interesting, like studied movement that he's depicting here. And would you mind popping up the screen share for a minute?
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to take a look at a historic example of this. So here's a close up. Here, let's look at the full one of this. This is a mosaic from 100 BC of Alexander in battle, and
And the close-ups from right here.
yeah, from right there. And this mosaic was found at a house in Pompeii, which was famously buried by volcanic ash. And so the mosaic was mostly intact for thousands of years underneath the ground. And although it was executed in probably 100 BC or 150 BC, it's most likely based on a painting that was famous 1 or 200 years before that. So the guess is that it was like an Etruscan painting is the source for this. But anyway, if you see, there's actually very similar kinds of tactics being used here in this depiction, where you have both sides, although the Alexander's side is mostly wiped out
Yeah.
by the damage. You have both
Ironic.
sides, right? You've got both sides being depicted in a way that is slightly diagrammatic, and that you want to be able to differentiate the forms from each other and basically tell the armies apart from each other. um, and you have these sort of massed spears giving some depth, to it, as well as the overlap in the front. And I don't know, I thought it was a interesting combination drawing. And also note like these horses, of course, being drawn 2,000 years before any kind of photographic technique was available, which meant all of them would have had to been studied.
Yeah, and you don't get the sense in Berserk either that any of this is photo referenced.
No.
Like he's like his. I really do like his horses. Like when you were asking for a page with horses, I thought it was just because like his horses are so nice, and horses are beautiful, strong animals, and he gets that in there.
Right.
So equally impressive in Berserk. But yeah, I like the idea of the clump, uh, like the army as a totality, and your individuality doesn't count at all. Even the guys who you can see their faces, they're pretty homogenized throughout. It's
Right.
also like that would be just crazy to go in terms of time spent drawing a manga. And then you also wanted to look at this image here.
Yeah, and so this is from the late Renaissance. This is Antonio. How did you pronounce his last name? You've got the Italian name.
Poliolo.
Yeah,
I
Poliolo.
would I would guess I can barely speak English, so
And we were discussing whether this is an etching or an engraving. I thought it's an etching, but anyway, regardless, um, this is a Battle of the Nudes, and you notice he's got his name on the back there on the sign. This is
yeah, I
essentially
just saw that.
this is that he's telling you where he lives too.
Yeah,
Um,
Florent.
so this is basically like a demonstration of his skill, that he would have put together and made prints of, and maybe dropped it off for potential patrons. But I thought this was a very interesting image. You have a similar like diagrammatic quality to it, in that the figures, even though they're making individual actions, are not hyper individualized. You have a few basic faces, and their actions are varied, but the faces and the sort of anatomy aren't.
Yeah, really homogenized anatomy. Like they're all the same height, the same amount of. It's like they took the 7 heads. Well, these guys look like they're 6 heads tall, but
Right.
6 heads tall, and the two heads wide for the shoulders.
Right.
The other thing that I think makes it diagrammatic that's similar to what Miura does is focus on a heavy outline with some variation in line weight, but it's there's some contour, there's some overlap, but it's mostly a heavy outline filled in with, in this case, hatching. There's not cross hatching, but it is a similar approach in terms of that light use of line. I mean, this has more variety in the values, but yeah, the more I look at this, the more it looks like that kind of golden age artwork. So I am curious if he was looking at drawing influences. By the way, I just have to zoom in, like these weird nipples that are going backwards. I just noticed that's while we were looking at it. Like this guy's got normal nipples, but this guy's like got 2 holes in his chest.
So we've got some variation.
Yeah.
I also love the headbands there. You're gonna fight.
Yeah.
Dude, but
You gotta tie your hair back.
Right.
Your junk could be out, but you gotta tie your hair back. Instead of just cutting your hair, you gotta tie it back because it might get in your face.
I'm not saying this is a 1-to-1. It's not like he's sitting around looking at this. It's just interesting to me to look at different historic approaches to the same kind of topics, I guess.
It's like a solution. Like how do I deal with this
right
subject matter? And I think you wind up getting a lot of the same solutions over and over. Like when I'm looking at all the spears in the mosaic in
right.
Berserk, it's like, well, that's also Frank Miller's 300 has that same like just spears fanning out. Like you kind of have to do that, and it works really well. At this point in the book, too, the art's reproducing better, so that's helpful. And a lot of his cross hatching seems. He's a very, you keep saying diagrammatic, and you were comparing it to like European art. He is very regimented in his hatching, always like exactly the same space. And, it doesn't have that chaos that you're saying a lot of the manga has where they're going really fast. But when you get the better reproduction, it works better. And I also get the sense that he's learning, and I don't know just because the poor reproduction, but it looks to me like he's learning to just hatch in some spaces. Something I didn't like earlier on is that it's always cross hatched and they always kind of line up exactly. He's letting some of the hatching actually just go out, like right here, it just goes out on its own,
Yeah.
and you get a better fluidity between it's gradients. You're creating gradients from dark to light instead of just like here's the light part, here's a patch of gray, and then here's dark gray or black.
Right.
It's a more fluid look. So I think
Yeah, what's
he's
that?
gotten better.
What's that? Uh, yeah, no, that particular splash page has something that happens a lot later too, where the variation in line weight enables things to sort of hold together a little more too.
Dad, I made
Um,
a skeleton mask.
you made a skeleton mask.
One part.
Oh, let's see the mask.
One part.
Okay, will you pass me one? I'm gonna let it dry for a while before I put it on. Okay.
Yeah, what?
Thank you.
Dried
This is my son Rowan has made a skeleton mask for me.
Wow, that is very good. And he wants
awesome.
you to put it on.
Yeah, I'm gonna wait till it dries first.
You're gonna wear it. Okay.
I am. Yeah. Thanks, Rowan.
I already dried it.
Here we go.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna let it dry now. Okay.
Yeah, what? And not all the way dried, so you can dry it tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you.
We should have Rowan do a. Do you want to see these books? It would just be blah 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 blah.
Hey, now,
Okay.
he's working on it. No, you're right.
Yeah.
The reproduction does pick up around the same time that my perception of the artwork was that he was getting a handle on what to do with the hatching.
Yeah, so I want to give him credit and say maybe he was actually just good all along, and the reproduction is doing a disservice.
Well, yeah, we should just clarify, like, Carson and I talk about something not being good. I mean, you set your own standards. This is one of the hazards of serializing a book for 30 years is you're comparing, 20 pages that you did in 1989 to 20 pages that you did in 1999 or 2009. And there's going to be some month-to-month variation, especially when you're experimenting. I mean, the amount of experimentation that happened in the first 300 pages of this volume is insane. I mean,
Well, and in the first volume too.
right, it's not typical of a manga production that's being serialized to have that much variation. In fact, I was comparing it to just because I'm rereading Battle Angel Alita right now, which is by Yukito. I'm not going to remember his last name. It starts with K. But it's an interesting comparison because he hits it right out the gate. He hits a style that works, and then he just sticks with it for like 15 years.
Yeah, which like why wouldn't you?
Right. Whereas, I mean, one of the things that I think is quite extraordinary, Kentaro Miura's work that we've looked at so far is just that he's restless. He tries these things out, and then he sees what works, and then he grabs them and he moves on to something else. And by the end of this mega volume, that's when I was thinking, oh my gosh, like this guy has just really got a particular style. But like the hatching stuff, I mean, he just tried stuff out and got he starts applying it in different ways. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and it seems driven by the mood. Like he'll switch styles driven by the mood of the particular part of the story, which I personally also really resonate with. Like I like shifts in art that match what's going on in the story. That heightens the impact for me. Some people could find it distracting, but I find that very compelling. But it still looks like his art throughout. It's not like he's all of a sudden, drawing like Chris Ware or something,
right?
Which I would be more prone to do something like that. But
and we're about to hit the another huge stylistic departure, Nosferatu Zod.
Yeah, I want to note first you get like Griffith is now trying to make his ascent towards having his own kingdom. So their mercenary band is starting to get involved with one of the kingdoms in the war, and he's kind of aligning himself to a king. you know, and he's like kissing the sword, kind of kneeling down and kissing the sword, which again, for me in this book always has these sexual connotations.
Look at it.
And here he's, you know, I will get my own kingdom. And so now they're sending him out on a mission, right? Because of this Nosferatu Zod guy, and he's working for the king now. I don't know if it's happening yet, but he's like flirting with the king's daughter at some point too.
Right, coming up fairly soon. So the Nosferatu Zod chapter, as it was the first time that I started really thinking about the translation, and I was just thinking about how different an impact the naming conventions would have in Japanese. Like for instance, like Guts being named Guts. I mean, in Japanese, his name is Guts. You're reading this in Japanese, Guts is his name. And I was trying to think of an equivalent to like an English speaker to a language that you maybe know from, you know, high school or something like that, but it's like got like a flavor of the exotic. What's a tough word? You know, it would be like the equivalent if you just named somebody like the word ballsy in Spanish or something.
Yeah.
Or, you know, what if his name was Cajones? You know?
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
what I was trying to figure out what the flavor would be of Guts in Japanese, and similar to Griffith. And then because Nosferatu Zod really puts it in your face that you are reading, in this case, like a naming convention that would be fairly exotic. I mean, Nosferatu in English essentially you just think, okay, it's that vampire.
Yeah.
Like unauthorized Dracula adaptation. And Zod, I mean, like
that's like Superman, right?
Villain, right?
Yeah.
And I just wondered, you know, I know that the sort of like manga fan thing these days is to think of any type of like translation of names as some type of phony baloney thing. But you know, I think that this would be you could have a pretty strong argument for thinking that a name like Nosferatu Zod should be translated to have something that evokes a similar feeling of exoticism as well as the sort of, you know, other context.
Because to us it's too familiar.
Yeah.
And almost cheesy.
Right. Exactly.
Like Nosferatu Zod, I was like, what? This is kind of silly. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But especially when they're using words we're familiar with, it would be extra weird to retranslate it into more words we're familiar with, or to translate it into words we're less familiar with. That would be a difficult choice to make as a translator.
Well, I don't think it would be a translator's choice. I would bet that somebody would just say, no, you got to keep all the names exactly the same.
But it's an interesting problem.
Yeah, it is.
Like, do you actually make it less readable on purpose because it was less readable in the original context? Yeah, that's interesting. And here we get back to a darker story too.
Yeah.
And he brings back all of the cool use of tone that I really liked, that I found was where he was experimenting the most in the first volume. Very weird experimental use of tone. And I think it makes the art richer.
It certainly does. Man, oh man, I had missed that like experimental tone stuff. The thunder clapping behind Griffith, the first images of Nosferatu Zod, where you have the really, yeah, you got it right there, the large tone behind him.
Oh, the weird like speckle tone. Yeah, I kind of find that tone ugly, but it works. Here's another real EC one too, right? So this is way more EC drawing than typical manga. Like even the eyes don't have the manga stylization to me. That looks like old EC horror comics. Everything just seems more realistic in that piece. And big brushy. And then, yeah, that weird, like big grainy dirt tone. So this is a totally shocking page to me.
Yeah.
Love it. It seems out of place, but that makes it work. And then, yeah, you get the Nosferatu Zod. There he is. He's a big beastie man.
Just horrific. Absolutely
creature.
Horrific.
And this stuff also reminds me of Dave's work.
Yeah.
on Judenhaus.
Right. That was I unfortunately that was one of the things that came to mind.
Yeah. And I wonder if he was looking at some of those photos of Auschwitz and stuff, because it has that same pile of bodies. and the cross hatching way denser,
Right.
but way more fluid, less stiff, and then tones over top of it. And it's not just that I like the experimentation. I like that the tones, when you're in black and white, we've talked about this before. It's like color. It's like painting, and it seemed very stripped of weight and color in these earlier chapters, and now like the weight and color seems back. Yeah, because scenes like this are just, oh my god,
Yeah, you get some
amazing.
really compelling drawing. Well, and rendering, I guess, is really, yeah, and the weight shifts. Man, oh man, like that one right there, where those support structures are hatched with super thick lines up there to make the dark areas. You got a huge variation in the line thickness across the piece, and then these super fine lines to hatch in all of the musculature of the demon thing.
Yeah, and just spotting blacks, like, which has been missing for a while, except
Right.
for someone having black hair. So I kind of missed that. Like, this is more what the book looked like initially, and it's like he's wrapped back around to that
Right.
approach. And I do like him when he has more variety. In flipping through, because I can't help myself, some of the later volumes, he does fluctuate back and forth between that diagrammatic style and this more rich, I think more rich style. So this stuff looks really cool, but some crazy bad guy, another big brushy, like he turns into this fat, like,
Fantastic.
and it's so everything's so thick. It almost looks like this one he drew it smaller and didn't shrink it down. Like, I get the sense that this was drawn at the size that it was going to reproduce, whereas all of these are drawn like twice the size and shrunk down.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it just has that thicker, weightier. I don't know. I love it. I almost wish that this was like what he was doing most of the time.
Yeah, this is.
I wish he'd put his pen away.
That's a very Charles Burns image. The previous page.
Yeah, it is not so rigid, but
right. No, like a drunk Charles Burns.
Yeah. Which is still super controlled.
Right. And
but yeah, I just all throughout this, like the way he's treating this character, pages like this, this stuff resonates with me a lot more. I love I have an image scan of this, the tone technique that he does. And then this picture right here.
Fantastic.
A lot of guys picked that up in America in the 90s. Like, I think I pointed this out in another manga. I've just always loved this effect. I think Todd McFarlane did a lot of this, but they do it with color. They'll put an outline and then have like a gradient of color. And something about that look, I haven't figured it out yet what exactly it is, but I love that. But Nosferatu Zod obviously can turn into a big monster, and he gets away, and it's pretty obvious to me this is going to be someone who they keep having to fight. Like, they've introduced another big bad.
Well, in the context of the story, this is the first time the characters have encountered something clearly supernatural, which that wasn't actually totally clear to me before, because some of the characters, like the Guts rapist, for instance, is so grotesque that I guess I had assumed that this was some type of animal.
This guy way back in the beginning.
Yeah, like an orc-like figure.
I think that's just to make him seem more reprehensible, though.
Right.
But yeah, he does look goblin-y, orky.
And so that hadn't occurred to me that this is the first time in the story that they're actually encountering that. And it was interesting to think about that. This double back that he's done, the switchback, where you've suddenly go back into the past. This is an incredibly effective storytelling technique, and it makes me wonder, the episodic thing from the future and then going back in time. It's just a very interesting structure.
And I don't know. I haven't. Obviously, I'm just. That's why I'm like really excited to keep reading now, because he has not yet flipped back to the future again. So as a reader, you've now read, hundreds and hundreds of pages that are all one continuous story that are driving towards the opening.
Right.
But the opening is years and years ago now, if you're reading this on a monthly basis. So that's really interesting. It was like like we were talking about that with Azadora too. Like the first
Right.
4 pages are in the future, and then you jump back and work your way towards it. Um, here's another scene. So and that's where I get caught up. Like, how does Griffith become that god level bad guy that he is? Seen and the hate that I picked up on these characters having this hate. How does that happen? And that's the question that I think is probably driving the whole series. And it's the question I want answered.
Right.
But here's another scene, more like manipulation. Um, he's just coming in and he's using the Zod character as like a manipulation of Guts. Let's see here.
Guts
And
has been injured in the battle.
yeah, and Griffith is explaining to him what the Bailet is, and he's also kind of talking about there's things beyond the human understanding in this world. For instance, gods or something, devils, and he says, who knows, aren't they the same thing?
Right.
And again, he's like this character that's androgynous, not just sexually but morally. Aren't gods and devils the same thing? By the way, how I'd make it out of that, I mean, I passed out partway through, and then he realizes that maybe the Bailet has kind of given him powers.
And another very interesting example of the techniques shifting a lot at the start of this volume here.
Yeah, but this light, it still feels lighter and more airy, but not.
Yes.
It's just nice to have that brushwork. And then they switch to basically a new volume, but that's where the manipulation really kicks in. They're talking about, he says, do I need a reason each time I put myself in harm's way for your sake? And then you get to the next volume and they repeat that. Tell me, do I need a reason each time I put myself in harm's way for your sake? So it's like, man, like how you're talking about that father relationship and the complex relationship with, someone who cares for you. Here's this guy who's like, I just love you so much, I'll put myself in harm's way for your sake. And you can see that impact that it has. And then here he's giving him this more, sexy eyes, and he says, no, and then they get interrupted.
And the king is interrupting them, and the king makes explicit the thing that we haven't necessarily perceived before, which is he refers to Griffith as the White Hawk. There's a duality going on here with Griffith, white-haired, fair, thin, and Guts, who's becoming more muscular, has dark hair. Guts' perception anyway is that he's the dark one. He's the dark half of the coin. If these two are in a duality, Griffith is visually the light one. However, as we're going to find out, maybe
well,
not.
I'm really curious about that, actually, because we've decided to look at JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and so I've read the first volume of that. We'll be looking at that coming up. And that same thing plays out where you have the dark-haired protagonist and the light-haired antagonist, and you got that in Fist of the North Star too. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, like, in our culture, yeah, the bad guy tends to be like draped in black and the good guy's the white knight. I'm wondering if in Japanese culture, if that association dynamic is flipped, because I'm always seeing the dark-haired character being the good guy ultimately, and the blonde character being the bad guy. So I wonder if black and white's flipped in terms of their cultural association, or I'm also thinking, is it a distrust of the outsider? Yeah. Like that it's always the blonde character, because we were pretty invasive. Like I think it's 1856, we go and we force Japan. We have a Navy officer who goes over and forces Japan to, reopen the interaction with the world. So I wonder if there just seems to be a trend I'm seeing. And so I'm curious where that's coming from. And then you get the princess comes in, and Griffith starts developing a relationship with her. Right. And by this point, you realize that Casca has a crush on him. Guts kind of has this thing,
Yeah.
and you see him. He's pardon my rudeness. So he's just social climbing at this point, and he got slapped, and so he's got a little bit of blood in his mouth, but he's got that flirty smile.
He moves on every person who can give him advantage, and he, it is a remarkable thing that he can keep the other ones on the hook at the same time.
Yeah, but it's making such a rich character, I think.
Yeah.
And then here's Guts. He's hanging out, and he's just mulling over like that statement. Do I need a reason to put myself um, in harm's way for your sake? And he's sitting there, and he says, "Now I will wield my sword for his sake." And again, it's kind of this masturbatory image. So to me, it's like funny, but uh, there's a lot of seriousness behind it now that now I understand the seriousness of the story. And then there's a whole assassination attempt. You wanted to talk about this spread here during the
Yeah.
assassination attempt where Griffith takes an arrow
Yeah.
for the princess.
So this is a section called assassination or assassin, and there's a whole section of it. But basically, like, I just found that the drawing just got specifically the touch of the pen just got so sophisticated. And this particular one really reminds me of like a sort of French illustration. Just the light touch of the pen and these sort of trees breaking out of the water and everything. It's just a very nice touch to it, and really, really masterful use of tone and texture. And yeah, it's a beautiful drawing.
And it makes sense as you move into, now they're in the royal court. So you're talking like Palace of Versailles, Rococo, I mean, they even have that kind of very over the top bows and ribbons everywhere. So again, I think his stylistic changes match the narrative changes, that he's going into a lighter, more flowery style.
And this one here has a rare use of a certain kind of hatching that I associate with the French artist Moebius, but also is familiar from some early Otomo work, like what is it called? Dororo. Is like a psychic Otomo work that takes place entirely in an apartment building.
Yeah, Dormu, something like
there
that.
You go. Yeah.
Dormu. I know what you're talking about. Like the weird kind of Jeff Darrow looking guy with all the stuff hanging off of him.
That's the one. Yeah. And then if you look at the hatching here on this area right here, it's just very, very nice. And once again, showing that he's integrated all of these different things to each other. You've got thicker hatching in a lot of areas, and that the hatching basically gets thicker as you go up into the darker areas, and then you've got some of the thicker black areas still hold together the left hand of half of the image.
And the whole page gets darker as it goes up with the silhouettes and the darker, again, reintroducing tone in a more clever way than it had been in the first chunk of this book.
Right. And some noise tone on top of the hatching as well, which is a very sophisticated, like, textural look.
Yeah. And then here again, more tone all over everything. So you get that all throughout, and that's where I really felt okay. Like I'm back invested in the art again.
Right. So Griffith had been attempted assassination attempt on him by the Viscount or whatever the other royal guy is, and Griffith has asked Guts to kill the Viscount or whatever in retaliation. And he says, for these reasons, I'm asking you to do it. Can I count on you? And he says, just cut to chase and order me to do it, like always. And so Guts goes to kill this guy who was attempted to kill Griffith. Griffith was only saved by the poison arrow striking the Bayless. As Guts is coming to approach his residence, this guy is dueling with his little kid. and is like cruelly.
What page are you on there?
548.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. Okay, I got it.
He's dueling with his little kid and like cruelly knocking him to the ground, and basically like forcing him to try to be a man. And Guts has flashbacks to him and Gambino, which
Okay, here, yeah.
which makes that all the more wrenching what's actually going to happen in this sequence. So he goes into the residence and he kills the royal guy, and as he's popping out of the residence, the son has come into the room unbeknownst to Guts, and Guts gets him right through.
Yep.
And
because it's just like someone's coming in the door, he's not paying attention.
Exactly. And this sort of shocked look on his face mirrors the sort of shocked look that young Guts has as he's at the beginning of the volume, like 600 pages earlier, as he's shot in the back by an arrow. This is a very like, I don't know, they're looking directly at each other, and you see Guts' realization that he's like making eye contact with a dead kid
that he killed. Yeah, and it's like resonating back to something, and it resonates back to the end of the first deluxe edition, where Omar said the moment where Guts cries after the girl dies, and that was the time where he was like, wow, usually you don't get these macho men having this emotional response to things in manga. That was when Omar realized that this was like a different book.
Right.
Yeah, so it's another one of those. Yeah, that is a brutal scene.
Totally brutal, and you just get the weight of it. And it's funny, that they show you the little image of Gambino to remind you, but
yeah,
but I don't even know if it's really how necessary it is. Like you can just tell, and then he turns off his emotional response and has a fight or flight response instead,
and chops through all the guards.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and ends up in a sewer.
And dreaming about getting stabbed himself by Nosferatu Zod. He has dreams. Yeah, he has dreams multiple times throughout the story. That seems to be a big part too, like this rich interior life. And then you move. Sorry, go ahead.
In the dream, he and Gambino are killed by Nosferatu Zod, and then his face is on Nosferatu Zod afterwards.
So he kills his father.
And himself.
His father figure, yeah. Yeah. And again, I really love that art style that he switches into in those moments. And then after that, you go back to Griffith as the manipulator. He's manipulating Princess. These two here, I scanned this, really going back to that super rich painterly use of tone. Like I can't even imagine pulling all of that off. These little water droplets and the reflections in the floor there are really great. And then he explains to her like that for a man, before he can obtain family and a sweetheart, maybe he needs to obtain something for himself, and that he has a dream, and he's kind of selling her on what he's trying to do, and that he spent his life as a martyr to the name of the dream. I spent life as a martyr to the god named Dream. And Guts and Casca are like down the stairs listening to him, and they both have feelings for Griffith, obviously. And this is what you're saying, he's able to kind of generate feelings in a lot of people and keep everyone else on the hook, but it's causing damage in them too, to hear him kind of tell what he's up to.
Right.
To this princess. So that there was a whole scene there. I don't want to like go through and read it all, but a lot of dialogue that was really important. And then he ends it all by saying, what I think a friend is one who is my equal. And you get this shot, another one of these down the stairs shots, right, which goes back to the end of the first volume. And so then I think, okay, Guts now has this goal of like, I need to become his equal.
So the thing I was saying before about the integration of all the different techniques, you know, you can really see it here on this panel. I just thought all of the artwork on the basically the last 100 pages was really quite remarkable, but this panel sort of encapsulated some of that for me. This
one.
Yeah, this really light, fairly wild, comparatively wild hatching with in the fall with the two different tones and then an overlapping tone at the bottom. And it's just a really, really nice, sophisticated drawing.
Like longer hatching too, and like grassy hatching. This I associate more with typical manga style hatching, versus that tighter stuff that he does, like even on this one that's tighter.
But then
So yeah, that is cool to see those two next to each other.
And the sort of French line I was talking about too at the top, with all of the grass and the trees hanging over and their capes and everything. It's a very nice. The contour line has gotten better. And the next page there, like that tiny little panel of him popping out of the water with her, is just love all the little nuance to the lines. I mean, you know,
Right here.
yeah, exactly. All the little small variations to the lines, plus all the applied texture and, you know, the hatching to form her hair there, her hair streaming down as it's been dunked. I just love it.
Yeah, that to me that almost looks like the Anki Bilal. Is that how you pronounce his name? I don't think he's French, but old heavy metal artist.
Oh, okay, yeah.
His when he did pen and ink stuff, now he's always drawing with pastels, but that does seem more in that European heavy metal style, like that rougher, scratchier stuff too.
He's integrated all that stuff into the existing strengths. That's the interesting thing to me, is that basically all the exploration has paid off.
And then that continues in, be careful here about which page I open. This is the big. Now we learn about Casca too. And so you wanted to talk about all the.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love the image here of him protecting her, but also right after this we get her origin, and we find out basically that she has a similar past to Guts.
Yeah, has also suffered sexual abuse.
Right.
And in that moment, they've been antagonistic towards each other until now, because they're both won over by the narcissistic manipulator to have feelings for him. And so it's almost like they're competing for Griffith's affection. But here they make a more honest connection over that shared trauma. Right. And it's not manipulative. It's an honest connection with each other. And so now I think they're forming this bizarre love triangle that's going to continue to play out. And I'm interested to see how that plays out in the coming volumes. But the tension between a relationship built around truth and a relationship built around manipulative deception seems like a really rich thing to explore. Yeah, and here you see that she had been basically like not sold into slavery, but similar situation.
Her parents wanted to give her an opportunity to go with this nobleman who supposedly is going to have her be like a scullery maid or something. And instead, of course, he wants to, you know, take her out in the woods and abuse her. And she's rescued by Griffith, who chops off the guy's ear and then prods her into killing him herself.
And you see, you see that here, that he's always kind of presenting himself as this savior figure. And he's also rebelling against nobility. Being born of nobility, does that mean you're chosen by God? So he's, as the social climber he very rightly, and I'll be interested to see what his background is, but he's very rightly pointing out currently he's fighting against the noble status. And I think given the fact that he winds up being some super powered entity, that eventually he'll say, well, like in the same way that what separates nobility from a peasant, like how's those categories formed? Why is a peasant held back from being nobility? He's going to at some point say, like, why can't a human be a god?
Right.
And that endless pursuit, that martyr for the dream. And he told the princess, he says, you can't have friends or love until you've achieved that thing. And they think that he could be a lover. They think he could be a friend, but there's no way he could do that because he's kind of going to be restlessly pursuing God status. And there's no end to that quest, I don't think, right? Like there's always one more level up. And so it's a sad, sick character. But they talk about him as like this awe-inspiring and otherworldly spectacle. I thought God had taken pity on this miserable, powerless girl and sent an angel.
An angel who commands her to kill or suggests that she do so.
Yeah, and then he takes the sword and is like, if you have something to protect, take up that sword, and then has her kill the guy who's assaulting her. So he's always like doing this weird saving and corrupting at the same time, which is like the utmost of sickness to me. In all this other world of sexual abuse and sickness, like what he's doing seems the sickest. Somehow. Tending to be pure in order to ruin purity.
And like a true serial, we don't get resolution of any of these things by the end here. We are just ready for volume 3.
Yeah, and I've been like holding back on on reading it for like 2 months now.
Sorry.
So I finally get to read that one. Now I wanted to take a look at, just because there was so many reproduction issues early on in this volume, and you had sent me that too. You were like, "Oh my god, it's so bad."
I have been sensitized to all this stuff, and so it was pretty bad. So so here's some pretty bad blowout, and you can see the dirtiness of it. This is not just photographic blowout. This is multiple generations down. So basically, like, however this was photographed originally, this was then reprinted from a printed edition, and they've spiked the exposure to try to keep the fill in to a minimum, and they've gotten rid of all the hatching as a result of it.
Yeah, and I mean that's like 33% on the scan, and you can still see how bad it is.
Right.
So I am very curious if anyone that winds up watching this knows what happened with that, what would be volume 4. I would really like to know, like, did the negatives get burnt in a fire? Did they get lost? I mean, you've told stories about things getting locked up and heists having to happen to get the negatives back. And we're learning from everything that's going on with Strange Death how bad things can go in the print world. So I'm curious what the story is on that, because it's not negligence on Dark Horse's part, and I find it very odd that Miura, with all of the work that he puts in, would just like let this happen if there wasn't a good reason for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the negatives just weren't kept for some reason, but it's we noticed that in the first story of the first volume. It was like the very first story.
And I mean, scenes like this where Griffith is rendered with this beautiful, delicate hair is like just totally gone.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's just so hard to see that as an artist. But I mean, you get the idea. And then Casca, you see her like this, and you can, if you scan it and zoom in, you can kind of see the tone around where it would have been covering up line work, hatching. Like right here, there should have been lines all throughout there.
Yeah,
lines. And then when she comes in later, constantly has that tone on her that really did throw me off. The Baelet in volume 1, I had scanned this image because I thought it was such a bizarre technique, and you explained what the technique was and that it actually was a pretty good reproduction. But it looks like when I was in the like junior high in the early 90s, and people would make artwork by like typing, like with little crosses and stuff. It looked oddly computerized to me. I think he's using that shading technique better here.
Yeah, it's two pieces of overlapping tone, imperfectly overlapped. Yeah, this is a little bit less of a uh, you know in your face method. And it's also worth noting that the entire book has a slight bit of moire, probably because the negatives were scanned at one size and then resized, and probably at the scanning position they were like slightly sharpened or something.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like, unless you're super sensitive to it, you might not notice the reproduction thing in the last 200 pages or so.
Yeah, I didn't really see Moire. I mean, here it's just that's how they overlap the
Yeah,
tone.
no,
But
that's
it created a more even gray for me, so it looks more like shading. And you had pointed out that on this one, it made it look more uncanny,
right.
and you kind of sold me on that, but it really just felt too unnatural, and I think he saw that and got a little bit better at that. So you're talking about his evolving art.
Mhm.
I just think that that looks better than that. Although it is more unsettling, I guess.
Yeah.
Here's that technique that I love, where you have like either a big black line like throughout here, or he builds it up with a lot of hatching, and you create that like the core of the shadow basically, and then you fill in, like a lot of people would be tempted to fill this in all black. I don't know what it is about that look, but I do really like that technique, and they do it a lot in manga, but I thought he did it particularly well.
You know,
Go ahead.
it really reminds me of screen printing. Uh, so if there's a certain type of poster that was popular in the late 60s, early 70s, where you do a screen print of a photograph, and you can blow out all of the detail, and then essentially screen print in a midtone, where you would
Called
have
solarization, right?
solarization. There you go.
Yeah, you can solarize. We could actually do that on Photoshop. Can we do I have a photo to open real quick? I don't know, drawing. Let's see if we can solarize a drawing. It's a double exposure technique. That's an old, I'm gonna miss it. Okay, I'm not gonna mess with it.
Yeah, but
It's an old darkroom technique where you expose it twice to different amounts of light, and you actually blow out the blacks. Yeah.
right. That's what it reminds me of, anyway. It's like a solarized two-tone print, um, but it's an effect.
But it also has like the way shadow would actually work, which is the core of the shadow and then reflected light. So that works very well. And then also, like, this would be almost too imposing,
Right.
like over the characters. So compositionally, it just works. He does that a lot, and I really like that look every time. I found this tone to be absurd, and this goes to that Rococo thing.
Uh-huh.
Like, this looks like Rococo pattern to me. Like, by Rococo, we're talking about like a French style where everything's kind of like curly, like seashells and rocks in their decoration. Absurd thing to put in someone's hair for a tone, but
Like
I do think it adds to that, like, yeah, what the hell is that? But it adds to that like super fancy pants,
right.
like flowery French look. So bizarre choice, but thematically makes sense. Um, and then that two-page spread, one of them was the fountain with all of the tones scraped out to make the ripples. And then here, you explained this last time, where they put basically two of the same tone on top of each other, right?
Yep.
And then they etch out one of them to create the lighter value. And that was the stuff that I loved in the first volume, and was kind of missing all throughout the golden age arc
Mhm.
through this book. And when it came back in, I was just like really thrilled to see him. I know it takes more work, I'm sure, but it adds such a luscious quality to the art that I was really happy to see that coming back. And flipping through the other volumes, I see that it comes and goes. So I'll be curious to how I respond to that.
I wanted to share two quick things that I was thinking of as I was reading this volume. I told you told you before that I think that this type of hatching that he's trying at the beginning of the book is fairly rare in a certain kind of Japanese context. And here's one of the exceptions that I was thinking of is this is by Yu Kinutani. This was published by Viz about 1,000,000 years ago, and it's called Shion. And I think he drew this in 1986, and it's a very European influence
Oh yeah.
to the hatching, and you can see sort of like a essentially like a European rendering techniques in a pseudo European context over a sort of Japanese form. And it's a interesting book. And this guy is now.
You ever seen Rourke by Andreas? That reminds me of Rourke.
So this is like I would say like part Mobius, part Otomo, and
Yeah, that's Elutier Serpierre, that hatching, like on Druna, Druna.
I don't know.
That's him and Anki Bilal. Way more than there's a couple Moebius pieces that look like that.
Here's some Bilal in that cape.
Yeah, totally.
So anyway, I was thinking about this a little bit. This is almost like fetishistic in its application of those techniques. This is like a technique book, like somebody sat down, like, let me try this, as opposed to the Berserk stuff where he attempts to integrate it as he goes. And then I was also reminded of Vinland Saga,
which I want to read. So
yeah,
if you've got volume 1, I'll grab that.
Well, and Makoto Yukimura is the cartoonist. This is his first work, Planetes, which is fantastic. I love Planetes, and Planetes definitely has a Berserk influence in the characters and the way that they're stylized. And
that was pre or post Berserk?
This is post Berserk. This is from the early 2000s. So this is influenced by Berserk in terms of the character stylization. But then in Vinland Saga, he really goes to town with the hatching and the tone in a way that it reminds me more of the Berserk.
And is Vinland Saga pre or post Berserk? Because when I saw Berserk,
post,
I had seen Vinland Saga way before I saw anything from Berserk. So I immediately, those big battle scenes, I said, oh, that looks like what I've seen of Vinland Saga. So Vinland Saga would have been influenced by Berserk.
Yeah, exactly. This is fairly recent. Vinland Saga is the 2000. I think maybe it ran from like 2010 to now or something. And like Berserk was a monthly title after the first couple months of weekly serialization. It turned into a monthly title. Presumably because you have battles with 1 billion people running at each other, all with multiple layers of cross hatching and screen tone on top of them.
That's definitely a book I want to check out at some point. I keep seeing it around and it looks good, and like, I don't know, it's getting hard. Anytime anything gets a hardcover treatment, I assume it's serious business and I want to read it. I don't know what it is about a hardcover. This must be important. Like, that's how I pick books at a bookstore. I just, that one's a hardcover, it must be good.
So speaking of which, it looks like you've got an intriguing book there with you.
Yeah, hardcovers, because it's important.
When can we read The Strange Death of Alex Raymond? We had some.
Yes, Sean. So I've got here this is a Blue Meanie misprint. We had a misprint situation where some of the pages printed out without the blue. So there's going to be 9 of these where I go in and I fix that error by hand by drawing. Well, I don't know. I'm not finding it, but yeah. So there's a book here that I'm going to draw in, that I have drawn in. So these are misprinted copies. If you get a hold of these in the wild, they ain't no good.
Yeah.
Tell your store to give you your money back. But Sean, when can we expect to get a proper copy and a proper release of The Strange Death of Alex Raymond?
We have some news. Our printer liaison was managed to do some backflips and get some paper several months before when he had planned to. So we now have a new street date of December 1st. This might seem shocking to you unless you had earlier heard our street date. was going to be in next year, which is not going to happen anymore. So,
Well, that's good. Our street date was supposed to be first week of August, but it's been pushed back.
yes. So now we are first week of December. So the book is going to be in comic stores, and hopefully people who backed us on Kickstarter there in December 1st. Yeah, I hope that you guys will check it out, and I hope that Carson doesn't have to draw 4 pages by hand in every copy.
Yeah, no, well, there'll be 9 copies. I found the page, so this one's already. I've drawn the blue meanies in it. The blue meanies are something that has been cursing the project all along. So of course we had a problem with printing blue ink. So there will be 9 copies that have hand drawn, with me doing my best European Moebius-esque type of art. But if you haven't got a copy yet, it's looking like would be pretty close to sold out on the first day, especially given that there's all this extra ordering time on Amazon and whatnot. Yes. So make sure you order it now. All right, everybody. Thanks for following along. We appreciate your company.
And let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. What you'd like us to talk more or less about, and we will do our best to listen to the numbers.
You want to see all these books? Smash that subscribe button.